I still remember the smirk on Richard's face across the mediation table. That arrogant, self-satisfied smile I once found charming now twisted into something ugly as he leaned back in his expensive chair. Elena gets nothing beyond what's specified. In the prenup, he announced like he was declaring checkmate. The house is mine, the investments are mine, the summer cottage is mine. He emphasized each mine with a little tap of his finger on the polished mahogany. His lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, nodded along with practiced sympathy. My attorney Jessica remained perfectly still beside me, her expression giving nothing away. "And what exactly does Elena get?" Jessica asked, her voice calm and measured. Richard laughed, and spread his hands. "She gets her personal belongings and the Honda, as specified in the agreement she signed 12 years ago." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Should have read the fine print, honey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I flinched at the endearment, now weaponized. Jessica placed a steadying hand on my arm beneath the table. 12 years. 12 years I'd spent supporting this man's career, hosting his business dinners, renovating his properties, editing his presentations. 12 years during which we'd built a life I thought was ours, not his. And now he was discarding me with nothing but the clothes in my closet and a 5-year-old car. "We need a moment," Jessica said, gathering her papers. "Shh." Mediator nodded and pointed us toward a small conference room. Once the door closed behind us, I collapsed into a chair. "He's right, isn't he?" I signed it. I was 23 and stupid and in love. Jessica didn't immediately answer. Instead, she carefully opened her leather portfolio and removed a document I recognized. All too well, the prenuptial agreement I'd signed the week before our wedding, when Richard was a promising investment banker and I was a graduate student dazzled by his confidence and ambition. "Elena," Jessica said, her voice precise. "When you hired me, you mentioned you didn't have a copy of the prenup, that Richard had the only one." I nodded, ashamed of my naivety. "He said it was in our safe deposit box. I never checked." "And in 12 years of marriage, you never read it again?" I shook my head. "Richard said it was just a formality, that everything we built would be ours together." I laughed bitterly. I was an idiot. "No," Jessica said, turning the agreement toward me. Richard was the idiot. He never read page 7. I stared at her, uncomprehending, then looked down at the page she had opened to. It was dense with legal language, clauses and subclauses in tiny font. Jessica's manicured nail pointed to paragraph 16b. "In the event the marriage continues for a period exceeding 10 years, I read aloud, my voice growing stronger with each word, "this agreement shall be considered null and void, and all assets acquired during the marriage shall be subject to equitable distribution under state law, regardless of title or origin of funds." I looked up, my heart pounding. "What does this mean?" Jessica's smile was slow and satisfied. "It means your prenup expired 2 years ago. Everything is on the table: the house, the investment portfolio, the vacation property, his company shares. Everything. But how? Richard's lawyer drafted this. And Richard fired that lawyer 8 years ago, probably without ever reviewing what he'd signed. Lazarus and Reed was a prestigious firm, and they insisted on standard sunset provisions in their prenups. It was boilerplate language they included in every agreement. "Richard doesn't know," I whispered, the realization dawning. "Clearly not," Jessica's eyes gleamed. "The question is, do we tell him now, or let him continue thinking he has the upper hand? My mind raced with possibilities. Richard had blindsided me 3 months ago, announcing he wanted a divorce over Tuesday night dinner, as casually as if commenting on the weather. I'd later discovered he'd been meticulously planning his exit for nearly a year, moving assets, establishing separate accounts, documenting every minor disagreement as irreconcilable differences. He'd even started leaving his expensive watches and cufflinks at the office, afraid I might claim them. Not. Yet, I decided, a strange calm settling over me. Let's see how far he's willing to go, thinking I have no recourse. Jessica studied me for a long moment, then nodded. It's a risky strategy. He might hide assets if he feels too secure. Richard's arrogance has always been his blind spot. I said. He won't hide assets because he doesn't think he needs to. He believes the prenup protects everything. As we returned to the mediation room, I felt lighter than I had in months. Richard was still wearing that insufferable smirk, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging our return. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and he chuckled. "Have you reconsidered your position, counselor?" the mediator asked Jessica. "We maintain that the distribution outlined by Mr. Davenport is inequitable," Jessica stated formally. "My client has contributed significantly to the marriage and to the acquisition of marital assets." Richard sighed dramatically. "This is pointless. The prenup is clear." I caught Jessica's eye, and she gave me an almost imperceptible nod. "Perhaps we should take some time to reflect," I suggested, surprising everyone with my calm tone. "I'd like to review my options before proceeding further." Richard frowned, clearly expecting tears or anger. When I'd discovered his affair with his assistant 3 months ago, I'd given him both in abundance. Now my composure seemed to unsettle him. "Fine," he said shortly. "But the prenup isn't going to magically change, Elena." If only he knew. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As we left the mediation room, Richard brushed past me, already on his phone. I watched him walk away. The man I had once loved with my whole heart, now a stranger calculating how to discard me with minimum cost. "What now?" I asked Jessica once we were alone in the elevator. "Now," she said with quiet determination, "we prepare for war while he thinks it's already won." For the first time since Richard had asked for a divorce, I felt a spark of something other than grief, not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor, the knowledge that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. And sometimes it comes on page 7. The next morning I stood in the kitchen of what Richard now called his house, running my fingers along the marble countertop I had selected 3 years ago during the renovation. The veining in the stone had reminded me of waves, something comforting about its pattern, like the ocean beaches where I'd grown up. Richard had complained about the cost, but relented when his business partner complimented my choice during a dinner party. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten as I'd fallen into a spiral of memories. 12 years of them swirling around this house. The broken pipe disaster that flooded the basement our first winter. The dinner parties where I'd charmed Richard's clients while he closed deals. The night I'd found him in his study, head in his hands after a major investment had collapsed. And I'd stayed up until dawn helping him reconstruct his presentation to the board. "Are you still here?" Richard's voice cut through my thoughts. He stood in the doorway in his running clothes, AirPods in hand, impatience written across his features. He'd been staying at his condo downtown most nights, but occasionally returned. To collect things, or I suspected, to remind me that my days here were numbered. "I live here," I replied, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "For now," he rolled his eyes. "About that, my lawyer says you should start looking for an apartment. The mediation isn't going anywhere, and I want to get this house on the market before summer." The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. How easily he could dismantle our life together, treating me like an inconvenient tenant, rather than his wife of 12 years. I forced myself to take a slow sip of cold coffee, using the moment to compose myself. "Jessica thinks there may be grounds to challenge the prenup," I said, watching his reaction carefully. Richard laughed, the sound hollow in our high-ceilinged Kitchen. Jessica is wasting your money. That prenup is ironclad, Berkowitz assured me. Berkowitz, his current lawyer, a cutthroat divorce attorney with a reputation for leaving spouses destitute. Not the one who had drafted our original agreement. Prenups. Get challenged all the time, I persisted. Not this one. He grabbed a water bottle from the refrigerator, the one I faithfully kept stocked even now. Look, Elena, don't make this uglier than it needs to be. Take the Honda and your clothes and start fresh. You're still young enough to, you know. He waved his hand vaguely. Young enough to what, Richard? My voice was dangerously quiet. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, to find someone else, have kids, whatever you wanted that I couldn't give you. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. We'd agreed not to have children because Richard's career had always come first. His 60-hour work weeks, his constant traveling, his insistence that there would be time later. Until later became never, and then became divorce. How generous of you to worry about my future, I said. He missed the sarcasm entirely. I'm trying to be fair here. The prenup gives you exactly what you brought into the marriage. Nothing. I contributed during it. He checked his running watch, clearly eager to end the conversation. You were compensated for your contributions. You lived in this house, wore expensive clothes, took nice vacations. It's not like you had a real career to put on hold. Each word landed like a slap. My graduate degree in architectural history, set aside to support his career. My freelance museum consulting work arranged around his schedule. The business I'd wanted to start perpetually delayed because the timing wasn't right, or we can't take the financial risk right now. I have a meeting with Jessica at 10, I said instead of screaming all the things I wanted to. I'll be out most of the day. Fine. I'm having dinner with the Caldwells tonight, so I won't be back. He adjusted his AirPods. You should join. Next time. Barbara keeps asking about you. The Caldwells, his most important clients, Barbara and Thomas Caldwell, whose vacation home I'd helped design, whose anniversary I remembered when Richard forgot, whose children's names and birthdays I'd stored in my calendar to remind Richard to send appropriate gifts. Does Megan know them yet? I asked sweetly, referencing his 26-year-old assistant-turned-girlfriend. His jaw tightened. That's not necessary. Elena, just curious if your clients know you left your wife for someone half your age. Barbara Caldwell has daughters older than Megan, doesn't she? Richard's face flushed. My personal life is none of their business. Funny. It was their business when you paraded me around as your perfect wife. I'm going for my run, he muttered, turning away. He paused at the door. And Elena? The Caldwells have been my clients for 15 years. Nothing is going to change that. After he left, I gripped the counter until my knuckles turned white, fighting back tears of frustration. For years, I'd suppressed my anger, swallowing it down to maintain peace. Even now, with nothing left to lose, I'd let him have the last word. Jessica had encouraged me to start documenting everything. I pulled out my phone and recorded the details of our conversation while they were still fresh. Richard's directive to find an apartment, his dismissal of my contributions, his reference to his house that we'd purchased together, his admission about Megan. My meeting with Jessica wasn't actually until noon, but I couldn't bear to remain in the house any longer. I grabbed my purse and headed to the one place I'd always found clarity, the art museum where I'd worked part-time as a consultant before Richard convinced me to focus on our life together instead. The museum was quiet on Thursday mornings. I wandered through the modernist wing, the familiar artwork soothing my frayed nerves. Near the Rothko that had always drawn me in, I found Margaret, the curator I'd worked with for years. Elena. She embraced me warmly. I heard rumors. Are you okay? Depends on the definition of okay, I said, attempting a smile. But I'm surviving. Margaret linked her arm through mine, guiding me to a bench facing the massive painting. Tell me everything, and don't leave out the part where you destroy him completely. For the first time in days, I laughed genuinely. That's still a work in progress. I told Margaret about the prenup, the sunset clause, and our strategy. Margaret had always disliked Richard, sensing his dismissiveness toward my career aspirations long before I allowed myself to see it. He never respected your work, she said, when I finished. Even when the board specifically requested your curation for the Westfield collection, he acted like it was a cute hobby. I know. The words were painful to admit. I just didn't want to see it. Well, you're seeing clearly now. She pulled out her tablet. That's why I asked you to meet me. The director position for special collections is open. It's yours if you want it. I stared at her speechless. It was the job I'd dreamed of years ago, before Richard convinced me it would interfere too much with our lifestyle. I can't. Richard would never. I stopped myself mid-sentence, the absurdity of my automatic response hitting me like a wave. Richard would never approve. Richard would complain about the hours. Richard would worry about how it reflected on him. Richard was no longer my concern. When would I start? I asked instead. Margaret's smile widened. How's next month sound? Gives you time to settle your divorce drama. Perfect. Something unfamiliar bloomed in my chest. Possibility, excitement, the future suddenly opening before me instead of closing down. As I left the museum to meet Jessica, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Berkowitz wants to meet tomorrow. He has a settlement offer that might interest you. Be reasonable. I smiled at the screen. Be reasonable. Richard's favorite phrase whenever I wanted something he didn't. Be reasonable about the renovation budget. Be reasonable about visiting my parents. Be reasonable about my career aspirations. This time I would be anything but reasonable. Berkowitz's office screamed power and privilege, all gleaming surfaces, floor-to-ceiling windows, and what I suspected was a deliberately uncomfortable chair for the opposing party. I perched on its edge, acutely aware of the dramatic difference between my seat and the plush leather chair Richard occupied, a calculated intimidation tactic that might have worked 3 months ago. Now, with Jessica beside me and the knowledge of page 7 tucked securely in my arsenal, I found it almost amusing. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Davenport, Berkowitz began, emphasizing my married name like it was a temporary loan. We have a settlement proposal that should resolve this matter quickly and equitably. Jessica accepted the document he slid across the table, scanning it before passing it to me. I read it slowly, careful to keep my expression neutral despite the insulting terms staring up at me. The Honda, my personal possessions, a goodwill payment of $50,000 that was a fraction of what Richard spent on investment wine for his cellar each year, and a demand that I vacate the house within 30 days. This is your idea of equitable? Jessica asked, her tone making the question anything but innocent. Berkowitz leaned forward, hands clasped. Given the prenuptial agreement, this is extraordinarily generous. Mr. Davenport isn't obligated to offer anything beyond what's specified in that document. I glanced at Richard, who was examining his manicured nails with exaggerated boredom. This was all theater to him, another negotiation where he held all the cards, waiting for the other party to accept defeat. And if we don't find it generous? I asked quietly. Richard's eyes flicked to mine, a flash of annoyance crossing his features. Then you're being unreasonable, Elena. The prenup is clear. Prenups aren't always as clear as they seem, Jessica interjected coolly. Or as enforceable. Berkowitz's smile never reached his eyes. This particular agreement was drafted by a top-tier firm. I've reviewed it thoroughly. It's airtight. I wondered if he truly had reviewed it thoroughly, or if, like Richard, he'd simply assumed it contained the standard protections without examining the details. The thought made me bold. Tell me, Richard, I said, leaning forward slightly. Did You ever actually read our prenup? All of it? His eyebrows drew together. Of course I did. I'm not an idiot. When? Recently? Or 12 years ago when we signed it? Richard shifted in his seat, irritation showing. What difference does it make? Legal documents don't change over time. Jessica and I exchanged the briefest of glances. Some do, I said softly. Berkowitz cleared his throat. This line of questioning is irrelevant. The agreement exists, it's valid, and it governs the distribution of assets in this divorce. The offer. Before you is generous given those parameters. We'll need to review and discuss, Jessica replied, gathering her papers. My client will respond within 3 days. 1 day, Richard countered immediately. I have a buyer interested in the house. I need this resolved. Of course he did. Richard always operated with urgency when it benefited him, with endless delays. When it didn't. 3 days is standard professional courtesy, Jessica insisted. Unless there's some reason you're in a particular hurry. The question hung in the air, perfectly calculated to plant seeds of suspicion. Was Richard hiding something? Moving assets? The fact that he actually was, that he'd been preparing for this divorce for months before announcing it, made the moment even more delicious. Berkowitz glanced at Richard, who gave a curt nod. Fine, 3 days. But this offer expires then. As we left the sleek office building, Jessica allowed herself a small smile. He's nervous. Did you see how he reacted when you asked if he'd read the prenup? Because he hasn't, I confirmed. Richard delegates anything he considers tedious. He probably skimmed it 12 years ago and hasn't looked at it since, which works in our favor. Jessica checked her watch. I have another appointment, but let's meet tomorrow to discuss our counter. Counter? I echoed. Aren't we just going to invoke the sunset clause? Jessica's expression turned shrewd. Not yet. First, let's see what he's really willing to offer when he thinks you might challenge the prenup on other grounds. Make him sweat a little. I considered this approach as I drove home. No, not home anymore. To the house. The distinction mattered. For 12 years, I'd poured my heart into making that house our home, only to have Richard reclaim it as simply another asset in his portfolio. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front, a sleek convertible with the top down despite the cool spring weather. My stomach clenched as I realized who it must belong to. Sure enough, as I entered, I heard female laughter from the kitchen, my kitchen, followed by Richard's low chuckle. The sound froze me in place, a sudden wave of nausea washing over me. He had brought her here, to our house, while I still lived in it. I considered retreating, avoiding the confrontation, but something stopped me. This was still legally my residence. I refused to skulk around like an intruder. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps deliberate on the hardwood floors I'd selected. The laughter stopped abruptly as I appeared in the doorway. Richard stood at the island, a glass of my favorite wine in his hand. Beside him, perched on a bar stool, sat a young woman I recognized from company events. Megan, his assistant. Her blonde hair was loose around her shoulders, her makeup perfect, her dress casual, but clearly expensive. She looked like a college student playing dress-up in grown-up clothes. Elena, Richard said, surprise and irritation warring in his tone. I didn't think you'd be home. Home. The word stung coming from him. Clearly, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Hello, Megan. I believe we've met at the Christmas party. You helped with the coat check. The young woman had the grace to blush, her eyes darting to Richard. Yes, hello, Mrs. Davenport. Ms. Novak, actually, I corrected, reclaiming my maiden name with a confidence that surprised me. Though I understand the confusion. Richard's jaw tightened. Elena, we were just leaving. Megan needed to pick up some files from my office. I glanced pointedly at the wine glasses, the plate of cheese and crackers arranged on my serving board. Quite the working lunch. "This is still my house, Richard," I snapped, his composure slipping. "I don't need your permission to use it." "Of course not. Though I'm sure your lawyer would advise against entertaining your girlfriend in the marital home before the divorce is finalized." I kept my tone light, conversational. Judges tend to frown on that sort of thing. Megan stood abruptly, discomfort radiating from her. "Richard, maybe we should go. I can get the files another time." "No," he insisted, squaring his shoulders. "We're not doing anything wrong." I smiled thinly. "I never said you were. I'm simply noting that appearances matter in divorce proceedings, as I'm sure Berkowitz has explained." The mention of his lawyer seemed to penetrate Richard's defiance. He drained his wine and set the glass down with unnecessary force. "Fine. We'll continue at the office." He gathered some folders from the counter, placing a proprietary hand on Megan's lower back. "Don't wait up. The childish parting shot would have wounded me weeks ago. Now it barely registered." "I'll be out this evening anyway," I replied. "Having dinner with the Whitmans." Richard paused, his expression shifting. The Whitmans, Alexander and Camille, were potential investors he'd been courting for months. I'd helped him prepare presentations for them, research their interests, even suggested the perfect restaurant for their first meeting. "The Whitmans?" he repeated, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Camille called me. She said she missed our conversations about Renaissance art." I adjusted a vase of flowers on the counter, the picture of casual indifference. "Apparently they've been wondering where I've been at recent meetings." It wasn't entirely true. Camille had reached out, but to check on me after hearing rumors about our separation, not to discuss art. The dinner invitation had come from me, a strategic move Jessica had encouraged. Maintain relationships with his business contacts, she'd advised. Remind them you were an integral part of his success. Richard's confidence faltered visibly. "What are you playing at, Elena?" "Playing? Nothing, just maintaining friendships." I smiled pleasantly. "I should get ready. Enjoy your afternoon." As they left, I heard Megan whisper, "Who are the Whitmans?" Followed by Richard's terse, "Not now." Alone in the house again, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. For the first time since he'd announced he wanted a divorce, I'd managed to unsettle Richard, to make him question whether I was truly as powerless as he believed. It was a small victory, but it fed a growing resolve within me. Richard had built his success partly on my unseen labor, my networking, my research, my social intelligence. He had disregarded my contributions for years and now assumed he could discard me with minimal consequence. Page 7 of our prenup would prove him wrong. But first, I would let him continue to underestimate me, to reveal just how far he was willing to go when he thought he held all the power. I pulled out my phone and texted Jessica. "He brought his girlfriend to the house while I'm still living. Here, definitely time to make him sweat." Her response came immediately. "Perfect. Now we have leverage beyond the prenup. Tomorrow, we go on offense. I climbed the stairs to prepare for my dinner with the Whitmans, a strange calm settling over me. For 12 years, I'd been Richard Davenport's wife, carefully managing his world while subordinating my own needs and ambitions. Now I was becoming someone new, someone who understood her value and refused to be diminished. Someone Richard had never truly known, and therefore could not predict. The dress I chose wasn't one Richard had selected. It was one I'd purchased myself on a rare solo shopping trip last fall. He'd barely noticed it then, muttering something about the color being fine without looking up from his phone. Now, as I fastened my grandmother's pearls around my neck, I realized how symbolic the choice was. This evening wasn't about playing the perfect corporate wife. It was about reclaiming my own connections. Dinner with the Whitmans went better than I could have hoped. Camille, with her art historian background, had always been more my friend than Richard's, though he'd never recognized that. Alexander, typically reserved during Richard's business dinners, opened up when the conversation turned to his passion for architectural preservation, a subject Richard had always dismissed as boring charity work, despite its importance to the Whitmans' investment decisions. "We've missed your insight, Elena," Alexander said as we lingered over dessert. "Richard's presentations just aren't the same without your humanizing influence." I took a careful sip of wine, weighing my response. "I've been dealing with some personal changes." Camille's hand covered mine briefly. "We heard Richard brought his assistant to the Hoffman's charity gala last week. It was noticed." The image hit me with unexpected force. Richard and Megan at the annual gala I'd helped organize for years, moving through the crowd of people I knew, perhaps even accepting condolences about his failed marriage while painting himself as the wounded party. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. "I imagine it was," I managed, striving for dignity rather than bitterness. "And yes, we're divorcing." Alexander exchanged a look with his wife. Richard mentioned it was amicable. A surprised laugh escaped me before I could contain it. "Is that what he said?" "I take it that's not an accurate description," Camille observed dryly. "Let's just say Richard and I have different definitions of amicable and fair." I straightened my shoulders, remembering Jessica's advice about maintaining professional connections. "But I don't want to burden you with my personal problems." "It's hardly a burden when we're asking," Alexander countered, leaning forward. "Elena, contrary to what Richard might believe, our relationship with your family was never solely about business. We genuinely value you, your expertise, your perspective." His words warmed something cold inside me. For years, Richard had insisted that his business relationships were fragile, dependent on his careful management, that my role was to be pleasant but mostly invisible, a supportive backdrop to his financial wizardry. To hear Alexander suggest otherwise felt like validation I hadn't known I needed. "That means more than you know," I admitted, "especially now." Camille studied me thoughtfully. "Is there anything we can do?" I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Just this, dinner, conversation, a reminder that I exist beyond being Richard's soon-to-be ex-wife." "You've always been far more than that," Camille assured me. "And speaking of being more, Alexander and I were discussing the restoration project for the Franklin Theater. We could use a consultant with your background." My heart skipped. The Franklin Theater was a historic Art Deco landmark that the Whitmans had purchased to save from demolition. "Are you serious?" Alexander nodded. "We need someone who understands both the historical significance and the practical considerations for modern use. Your dual background in architectural history and museum curation makes you uniquely qualified." It was a dream opportunity. Exactly. The kind of project I'd wanted to pursue before Richard convinced me to focus on supporting his career instead. The kind of work that valued precisely the expertise he had minimized. "I'd be honored," I said, not bothering to hide my enthusiasm. "Though I should mention I've just accepted a position at the museum as well." "Even better," Camille beamed. "This would be a separate consulting arrangement. We want your specific expertise, not your full-time commitment." By the time we finished dinner, we'd outlined the basic parameters of my involvement with the theater project. I drove home with a sensation I hadn't felt in months: purpose. Not the reflected purpose of supporting Richard's ambitions, but my own, rooted in my education, my passion, my abilities. When I arrived at the house, Richard's car was in the driveway. I briefly considered driving around the block to delay the inevitable confrontation, then dismissed the thought. This was still legally my residence. I wouldn't skulk around like an intruder. I found him in his study, surrounded by papers, a glass of scotch at his elbow. His eyes narrowed when I appeared in the doorway. "How was dinner?" he asked, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. "Lovely. The Whitmans send their regards." "I'm sure they do." He shuffled papers unnecessarily. What exactly did you discuss? Art, architecture, their new theater restoration project. I paused, letting the moment stretch, which they've hired me to consult on. Richard's head snapped up, surprise evident before he masked it. You're not qualified for that. The dismissal might have crushed me weeks ago. Now it merely confirmed what I already knew about how little he valued me. Actually, I am. My graduate degree is in architectural history, and I've worked in museum curation for years. I kept my voice level, despite the anger simmering beneath. The Whitmans specifically cited my qualifications. A courtesy offer, Richard scoffed. They're just being nice to you because of our situation. Is that what happened with Megan too? You hired her as a courtesy? His expression hardened. That's different. Megan has actual skills. The casual cruelty stole my breath. 12 years together, and he could dismiss my education, my expertise, my intelligence so easily. The Whitmans don't agree, I said when I could trust my voice again. Neither does the museum board who've offered me the director position for special collections. Something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect, quickly replaced by calculation. 2 job offers right as we're negotiating our divorce settlement. Convenient timing. Not really. These are opportunities I could have pursued years ago if I hadn't been so focused on supporting your career. Richard sighed dramatically, adopting the patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being difficult. Elena, let's be realistic. You helped organize some dinner parties and made small talk with my clients' wives. That's hardly the same as building a business from nothing like I did. The fury that rose in me was white-hot and clarifying. Every late night I'd spent editing his presentations. Every client I'd researched so he would know their personal interests. Every connection I'd cultivated that he'd leveraged for business. Every investment property I'd identified, restored, and increased in value while he claimed the credit. Is that what you tell yourself? I asked quietly. That I contributed nothing of value to your success? I'm not saying you didn't help, he backpedaled slightly. Just that your role was supportive, not essential. Then you won't mind that I've accepted both positions, I smiled thinly, since my expertise is so unnecessary to your world. Richard's expression shifted, his business mind clearly recalculating. If I had income of my own, it might affect the divorce settlement, our relative financial positions, the image he'd crafted of me as a dependent housewife. Actually, I think it's great, he pivoted smoothly. This proves you can support yourself, which is exactly why my settlement offer is more than generous. The $50,000 gives you a cushion while you establish yourself professionally. And there it was, Richard's true talent. Taking any situation and reshaping it to his advantage, finding the angle that protected his interests above all else. How thoughtful of you. I kept my expression neutral, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his dismissal cut. Jessica will present our response to the offer tomorrow. Make sure it's reasonable, he warned, turning back to his papers. Berkowitz isn't known for his patience. As I left his study, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Meeting set. For 2 p.m. tomorrow. Time to show our first card. Our first card, not our full hand. I smiled at the strategic approach. Richard had always underestimated me, assuming I shared his transparent ambitions and limited emotional range. He couldn't conceive that I might have learned from watching him all these years, absorbed his tactics while maintaining my own principles. Tomorrow would be his first lesson in discovering who I really was. And page 7 still waited, our ultimate trump card, when the time was right. I fell asleep that night, not with the ache of betrayal that had been my constant companion for months, but with a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time since Richard had announced he wanted a divorce over Tuesday night dinner, I felt something like excitement for what came next. Not because I wanted to hurt him, though the thought had its appeal in my darkest moments, but because I was finally fighting for myself, For my value, for the recognition that I had contributed substantially to building the life he now claimed as exclusively his own. And in that fight, I was discovering pieces of myself I'd set aside for too long. Jessica's office felt like neutral ground, a sanctuary where Richard's influence couldn't penetrate. I arrived early for our pre-meeting strategy session, clutching a portfolio containing documents I'd gathered over the past 2 days, appraisals of the artwork I'd selected for our home, records of my contributions to renovation projects, emails where Richard explicitly acknowledged my role in securing client relationships. "You've been busy," Jessica observed with approval, spreading the materials across her desk. "This is exactly what we need." "I've lived in Richard's shadow so long that I'd forgotten how much I actually contributed," I admitted. Pulling these records was illuminating. Jessica tapped a document showing my signature alongside Richard's on the purchase agreement for the vacation property in Maine, the one he now claimed as solely his. "Particularly this. He can't claim exclusive ownership when you're clearly listed as co-purchaser. He'll say I was just signing as his wife, that he provided all the funds. Except for this." She held up a bank statement showing a substantial transfer from my personal account, inheritance money from my grandmother that constituted the down payment. "You provided 30% of the purchase price from your separate property. That's not just being supportive." The validation felt like oxygen after years of breathing Richard's dismissiveness. Perhaps I should have fought harder for recognition during our marriage, but Richard had been masterful at recasting my concerns as insecurity or ingratitude. Now, with Jessica's clear-eyed assessment, I could see how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. "What's our strategy for today?" I asked, refocusing on the task ahead. "We present a counteroffer that establishes your significant contributions without revealing the sunset clause," Jessica explained. "We want to see how far Richard is willing to negotiate when he thinks the prenup might be challenged on other grounds. Duress, substantive unfairness, lack of proper representation when you signed. He'll dismiss all of those. Of course he will, but his response will tell us how concerned he really is." She gathered the documents into a cohesive presentation. "And most importantly, the more Richard digs in about the validity of the prenup, the more shocking our final reveal will be." I nodded, understanding the strategy. Richard needed to publicly, repeatedly, emphatically rely on the prenup for his position. Each time he did so, he drove another nail into the coffin of his case when we finally revealed page 7. "What if he offers something reasonable today?" I asked. "Just to make this go away?" Jessica's smile was knowing. "Richard won't. Men like him don't compromise until they have no choice. His ego won't allow it. Berkowitz's assistant ushered us into the conference room exactly at 2 hours. Richard was already seated, scrolling through his phone with ostentatious boredom. He barely glanced up as we entered. A power move so transparent I almost laughed. "Thanks, you for accommodating our schedule," Jessica began, her tone professionally neutral. Berkowitz nodded briskly. "I understand you have a response to our generous offer." "We do." Jessica slid a document across the table. "My client proposes the following alternative settlement." Richard finally pocketed his phone, watching as his lawyer reviewed our counteroffer. I kept my expression calm, though my heart raced as Berkowitz's eyebrows rose incrementally with each page. "This is absurd," he declared after reaching the final page. "Your client is requesting half the value of the primary residence, 30% of the main property, a portion of Mr. Davenport's investment portfolio, and spousal support. The prenuptial agreement specifically precludes all of this." "The prenuptial agreement," Jessica countered smoothly, "was signed by my client without independent legal representation, under significant time pressure, 1 week before the wedding. There are serious questions about its enforceability." Richard leaned forward, irritation breaking through his carefully maintained indifference. "Elena had every opportunity to review that agreement. She chose not to hire her own lawyer." Because you assured me it was a formality, I interjected, my voice steady despite the flutter in my stomach. A standard protection that we'd never need because everything we built would be ours together. That's not, Richard began, then stopped himself, glancing at Berkowitz. That's not relevant. You signed it. End of story. Jessica opened her portfolio with deliberate calm. Let's set aside the circumstances of signing for a moment and look at the contributions my client has made to the marriage and to Mr. Davenport's business success. For the next 20 minutes, she methodically presented the evidence I'd gathered, my financial contributions to our properties, my direct role in securing and maintaining client relationships, the business trips I'd organized, the presentations I'd helped craft, the investment opportunities I'd identified. With each new document, Richard's expression grew darker. His fingers drummed against the polished table, a nervous habit I recognized from board meetings when things weren't going his way. None of this changes the prenuptial agreement, Berkowitz insisted, though I noticed his confidence seemed less absolute. These contributions, while admirable, were made within the context of the marriage and with full knowledge of the existing contract. A contract that may be unenforceable, Jessica repeated. Courts increasingly recognize the substantive unfairness of agreements that leave one spouse with nothing after years of contribution to family wealth and success. Richard's patience finally snapped. He slammed his palm against the table, making his water glass jump. This is ridiculous. Elena knew exactly what she was signing. She understood my business was separate. Everything else is just wifely duties, the Kai. Dismissive phrase hung in the air, its casual sexism revealing more about Richard's true perspective than perhaps he intended. Berkowitz shot him a warning look. What my client means, the lawyer smoothly intercepted, is that Mrs. Davenport's contributions, while appreciated, were typical of a spouse in a high-net-worth marriage. They don't supersede a valid prenuptial agreement. Let me be clear, Jessica said, gathering her documents. My client rejects the initial offer as wholly inadequate given her substantial contributions to the marriage and to Mr. Davenport's success. Our counteroffer reflects a more equitable distribution based on those contributions. And let me be equally clear, Berkowitz countered. Mr. Davenport rejects this counteroffer as it directly contravenes the prenuptial agreement both parties signed willingly 12 years ago. I watched Richard's face as the lawyers exchanged their formal statements. He was angry, yes, but there was something else, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he was considering that this might not be the simple, clean break he'd envisioned. Perhaps, Jessica suggested, we should all take some time to reconsider our positions. Mr. Davenport might want to review the prenuptial agreement, again, carefully, to ensure his confidence in its provisions is well-founded. The seemingly innocuous suggestion caught Richard's attention. His eyes narrowed slightly, clearly wondering if we knew something he didn't. It was exactly the seed of doubt Jessica had wanted to plant. That won't be necessary, Berkowitz responded, but we will review your counteroffer and respond formally, within the week. As we gathered our things to leave, Richard suddenly addressed me directly. Elena, this adversarial approach isn't like you. What happened to the reasonable woman I married? The question struck me as so profoundly ironic that I couldn't help my response. She woke up, Richard. She finally woke up. Outside in the building's marble lobby, Jessica's professional demeanor relaxed into a satisfied smile. That went perfectly. Did you see his face when I suggested he review the prenup again? He's worried. But not worried enough yet. He will be, Jessica assured me. When Berkowitz actually examines the agreement more closely, he might spot the sunset clause himself. That's why we need to move quickly with Phase 2. Phase 2, the financial discovery process. While Richard was distracted by our counteroffer, we would use formal legal channels to demand complete documentation of all assets, accounts, and transactions. It was standard procedure in any divorce, but in this case, It served a dual purpose: to uncover any assets Richard might be hiding, and to further reinforce his reliance on the prenup as his primary defense. "How long do we wait before revealing page 7? I asked as we walked to the parking garage. "We let them respond to the counteroffer first," Jessica explained. "Once Richard formally rejects it, claiming the prenup as the basis for his position, we spring the sunset clause. His own documented insistence on the prenup's validity would make it impossible for him to then claim he didn't understand or agree to all its provisions, including the expiration after 10 years. The strategy made perfect sense, yet I felt a strange reluctance, not because I doubted its effectiveness, but because I was discovering something unexpected about myself through this process. The woman who had accepted Richard's dismissal of her contributions, who had stepped back from her own career to support his, who had believed herself to be just a wife, she was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, more determined. Someone who was reclaiming not just her financial due, but her sense of self-worth. As we reached my car, Jessica paused. "Elena, I need to ask, when this is over, when Richard realizes he's lost, what do you actually want from this divorce?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on strategy, on not being taken advantage of, that I hadn't fully contemplated the end result I desired. "I want recognition," I said finally. "Financial, yes, but more than that. I want Richard to understand that I was an equal partner in building our life together, not an accessory he could discard when convenient." Jessica nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part. The courts can divide assets, but they can't force recognition or remorse." "I know." Whatever the outcome of our legal maneuvering, Richard would likely never truly acknowledge the depth of his betrayal or the value of what he'd thrown away. That realization was both painful and freeing. I couldn't control his perception, only my response to it. "But I also want the freedom to build something new," I continued. "The museum position, the theater project with the Whitmans, those aren't just jobs to me. They're the beginning of a life I put on hold for Richard." "Then that's what we'll fight for." Jessica squeezed my arm gently. "The financial security to pursue that life without constraints." As I drove home, my thoughts weren't on Richard or the prenup, or even the impending legal battle. They were on the Franklin Theater project, on the collections waiting at the museum, on the possibilities unfolding before me that had nothing to do with being Richard Davenport's wife. For the first time since our marriage had imploded, I found myself thinking about the future with anticipation rather than dread. Page 7 would give me financial security, yes, but I was discovering that I had already reclaimed something far more valuable, myself. The formal response to our counteroffer arrived precisely 1 week later. I was at the museum, reviewing the special collections inventory for my upcoming position, when Jessica called. "It's exactly what we expected," she said without preamble. "Complete rejection. Berkowitz drafted a 15-page letter reiterating the validity and enforceability of the prenup, with multiple citations of precedent." My hands trembled slightly as I set down the catalog I'd been examining. "So Richard is doubling down?" "Tripling down, more like it. The letter states, and I'm quoting here, Mr. Davenport's position rests entirely and exclusively on the prenuptial agreement executed by both parties, which clearly and unambiguously establishes the division of assets in the event of dissolution of marriage." A smile spread across my face. "He couldn't have given us a better setup if we'd written it ourselves." "Exactly. He's now on official record stating that the prenup is the sole basis for his position." Jessica's voice held the quiet satisfaction of a chess player seeing checkmate. A few moves ahead. "It's time, Elena. We reveal page 7. Heat rushed through my body, anticipation, vindication, and a touch of fear. This was the moment we'd been building toward, but suddenly it felt overwhelmingly real. "I've already requested an emergency hearing with Judge Winters for tomorrow morning," she continued. "Both parties required to attend." She paused. Are you ready for this, Elena? Once we do this, there's no going back. Was I ready? The question echoed in my mind as I looked around the museum's archive room, my new professional home, separate from anything to do with Richard. I thought about the theater project with the Whitmans, already underway, the new apartment I'd found, but hadn't yet mentioned to Richard, who still believed I had nowhere to go. I'm ready, I said, my voice stronger now. More than ready. That evening, as I packed a few more personal items from the house, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Berkowitz says you requested an emergency hearing. What game are you playing now? I didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him spend the night considering what we might present tomorrow, what evidence we might have uncovered. Let him, for once, feel the uncertainty I'd lived with for months. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept imagining Richard's face when Judge Winters, known for her no-nonsense approach and distaste for game playing in her courtroom, read page 7 aloud. Would he be shocked? Angry? Would he try to claim he'd known about the clause all along? Or would he finally, just once, admit he'd been outplayed? Dawn found me already dressed in my most confident outfit, a tailored navy suit I'd purchased. For my museum interview, not one of the designer pieces Richard had selected for me over the years. Jessica had coached me on maintaining my composure regardless of how Richard reacted. The judge will be watching both of you, she'd warned. Emotional control matters. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate. Richard and Berkowitz were already seated at one table when Jessica and I entered. Richard's gaze locked onto mine, questioning, a hint of nervousness visible despite his attempt at casual confidence. Judge Winters, a silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes and decades of experience etched into her face, called the hearing. To order with brisk efficiency. I understand this is an emergency motion in the Davenport divorce proceedings, she noted, reviewing the file before her. Ms. Lockhart, as you requested this hearing, please proceed. Jessica rose, the picture of professional calm. Your Honor, we've requested this hearing to address a fundamental issue that renders further negotiation unnecessary. Specifically, we need to direct the court's attention to a provision in the parties' prenuptial agreement that has been overlooked in all discussions to date. Berkowitz shifted forward, frowning. Your Honor, we've thoroughly reviewed the prenuptial agreement. There are no overlooked provisions. If I may, Jessica continued, unfazed. She approached the bench with 3 copies of the agreement, one for the judge, one for Berkowitz, with relevant sections highlighted. I direct Your Honor's attention to page 7, paragraph 16b. My pulse raced as Judge Winters adjusted her glasses and read the section silently. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, the only indication of surprise from the otherwise stoic jurist. Mr. Berkowitz, are you familiar with this provision? She asked. Berkowitz was already frantically flipping to page 7, his composure slipping as he located the highlighted text. He scanned it once, then again, his face draining of color. Your Honor, I need a moment to confer with my client. By all means, Judge Winters granted, her tone suggesting she was not particularly impressed. I watched as Berkowitz leaned toward Richard, speaking in urgent whispers while pointing at the document. Richard's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, to a flash of pure, undisguised fury as he grabbed the agreement and read the clause himself. The sunset provision, the 10-year expiration, the complete invalidation of the prenup he'd been wielding like a sword. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom seemed to intensify, highlighting every micro-expression that crossed Richard's face. When he looked up, his eyes found mine across the polished wooden tables. In that moment, I saw something I'd never witnessed in 12 years of marriage. Richard Davenport completely blindsided. Your Honor, Berkowitz began once he'd collected himself. This provision appears to have been overlooked in our review. Overlooked? Judge Winters repeated flatly. Her reading glasses slid down her nose as she peered over them skeptically. A provision stating that the entire agreement becomes null and void after 10 years of marriage was overlooked by both you and your client. It wasn't a question, but Berkowitz attempted an answer anyway, sweat visibly beading at his temples. This language is unusual, Your Honor, not standard in modern prenuptial agreements. Yet it appears in plain English on page 7 of the document Mr. Davenport has repeatedly cited as the controlling factor in these proceedings. Judge Winters looked directly at Richard, who had regained his composure enough to straighten his silk tie, though a muscle twitched rhythmically in his jaw. The courtroom felt charged with tension, the few observers silent as the implications became clear. Mr. Davenport, am I to understand you were unaware of this provision in an agreement you've been relying on exclusively for your position? Richard straightened, his business persona sliding into place despite the blow. Your Honor, this clause must have been added after I reviewed the initial draft. I never— Draft, Mr. Davenport? The judge interrupted sharply, tapping her pen against the bench. Are you suggesting the document was altered after signing? That's a serious allegation. Berkowitz placed a warning hand on Richard's arm. No, Your Honor. My client is simply expressing surprise at a provision he doesn't recall discussing specifically when the agreement was drafted 12 years ago. I see. Judge Winters reviewed the document again, her reading glasses perched precisely on her nose, her expression unimpressed. The provision appears consistent in font, formatting, and placement with the rest of the agreement. There's no evidence of alteration. Moreover, both parties' initials appear at the bottom of each page, including page 7. My heart pounded against my ribs as the judge continued her assessment. This was exactly as Jessica had predicted. Richard's insistence on the prenup as his sole defense now trapped him into accepting all of its provisions, including the one he'd never bothered to read carefully. In light of this provision, Judge Winters concluded, her authoritative voice filling the hushed courtroom, the prenuptial agreement is indeed null and void, having exceeded its 10-year term by approximately 2 years. Therefore, equitable distribution of marital assets will proceed according to state law without reference to the prenuptial limitations. She glanced between the two legal teams. I suggest you reset your negotiations accordingly. We'll schedule a follow-up hearing in 30 days to review progress. Dismissed. With a tap of her gavel, 12 years of marriage and 3 months of bitter divorce proceedings were fundamentally transformed. The prenup that Richard had flaunted as his impenetrable shield was now irrelevant. Everything was on the table: the house, the investments, the vacation property, his company shares acquired during our marriage. Richard remained seated as Berkowitz gathered their papers, his face rigid with controlled anger. The wooden chair creaked as he gripped its arms, knuckles white. The courtroom emptied around us, but neither of us moved, locked in a silent standoff across the room. When he finally looked at me again, his voice was low but intense. You knew about this all along. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Not all along. I discovered it the same day you told me I was getting nothing but my personal belongings and the Honda. You could have said something then. Instead, I let you believe that the prenup protected you completely, I finished for him, rising from my chair. My voice remained steady, though my hands trembled slightly. The way you let me believe our marriage meant something to you, that my contributions to your success mattered. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Perhaps recognition of the symmetry, how thoroughly he'd been caught in his own trap. Then his expression hardened again. This isn't over, Elena. Jessica, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Davenport, legally speaking, it very much is. The prenup is invalid. The court will now oversee an equitable division of all marital assets which, given Ms. Novak's substantial contributions to your success, should be roughly equal. Richard stood abruptly, buttoning his jacket with the automatic precision of a man accustomed to controlling his environment. Berkowitz, we need to discuss our options, he snapped, already heading for the door. As they left, Jessica turned to me with a small smile. Congratulations, Elena. Phase 1 complete. Phase 1? I echoed, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline began to ebb. Getting the prenup invalidated was just the beginning, she explained gently. Now we negotiate the actual settlement from a position of strength. But that's work for another day. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine warmed my face as I took my first deep breath in what felt like months. The war wasn't over, but a decisive battle had been won. Richard would fight, of course he would. It was his nature. But he would no longer be fighting from a position of absolute advantage. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret at the museum. How did it go? I smiled as I typed my reply. The prenup is invalid. Everything changes now. Her response came immediately. Celebration dinner tonight. The whole department wants to welcome their new director properly. The invitation warmed me more than the sunshine. 3 months ago, when Richard had casually announced he wanted a divorce over Tuesday night dinner, I'd felt utterly alone, cut adrift from the life I'd thought we were building together. Now I had a career reclaimed, colleagues who valued me, projects that excited me, and a future that belonged entirely to myself. I'd love that, I replied. 7:00 p.m. works. 7:00 p.m. works. As I slipped my phone back into my purse, I noticed Richard standing by his car across the parking lot watching me. For 12 years, I'd arranged my expressions to please him, smiling when he expected approval, maintaining pleasant neutrality when he needed support, hiding any negative emotions that might burden him. This time, I simply met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see the truth. I was no longer his wife, no longer his support system, no longer defined by his assessment of my worth. After a moment, he got into his car and drove away. I remained where I was, savoring the moment. The courthouse steps seemed different now, no longer intimidating but simply stone and concrete, warmed by the spring sun. A light breeze carried the scent of nearby magnolias in bloom. Everything looked sharper, brighter, as if I'd been living in a muted world and someone had suddenly adjusted the contrast. There would be more negotiations, more legal maneuvers, more attempts by Richard to minimize what he owed me, both financially and morally. But the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He had believed I would get nothing. He had counted on my ignorance, my compliance, my acceptance of his definition of my value. Instead, I had discovered my own definition, written clearly on page 7 and in every choice I was now free to make. The settlement negotiations stretched. Over the next 6 weeks, with Richard fighting for every dollar despite the invalidated prenup. But his position had weakened dramatically. Without the prenup's protection, his arguments rang hollow even to Berkowitz, who gradually shifted from aggressive opposition to damage control. In the end, we settled on terms that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. Half the value of the house, 40% of the investment portfolio, shared ownership of the vacation property, and a substantial portion of Richard's company shares acquired during our marriage. More importantly, I reclaimed my identity beyond the divorce. My position at the museum blossomed into something more fulfilling than I'd imagined. The Franklin Theater restoration project with the Whitmans became a showcase for my expertise, generating interest from other preservation societies. For the first time in years, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Richard, predictably, found ways to rewrite the narrative. In his version, he had generously provided for me despite having legal grounds to offer less. He never mentioned page 7 or acknowledged how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. His ego wouldn't allow it. I saw him one last time, 6 months, after the hearing, at a charity event I attended with the museum board. He was there with Megan, who looked uncomfortable in her formal gown, constantly adjusting the straps. Richard seemed to have aged, new lines around his eyes, a slight softening around his jaw. He spotted me across the room, hesitated, then made his way over, leaving Megan with acquaintances. "You look well," he said. The standard opening gambit. Well, I replied simply. It wasn't a courtesy. It was the truth. He nodded, glancing around at the event, clearly searching for neutral territory. "I heard the Franklin Theater restoration is getting national attention." "Yes, the Preservation Society is featuring it in their annual publication." An awkward silence stretched between us. Once, I would have rushed to fill it, to ease his discomfort. Now I simply waited, observing him with a detachment that would have been impossible before. "You know," he finally said, swirling the ice in his drink, "I could have appealed the judge's decision about the prenup. Berkowitz thought we had grounds. But you didn't." "No?" He straightened his cufflinks, a nervous habit I recognized from board meetings. I decided it wasn't worth dragging things out. What he meant was that he couldn't risk the public record of a higher court confirming his oversight, his failure to read a document he'd relied on so completely. It would have undermined the careful image he'd constructed of himself as a meticulous businessman who controlled every detail. "That was probably wise," I said, my tone neither accusatory nor conciliatory, simply acknowledging the reality we both understood but would never explicitly name. Another silence fell. This one felt final. "Well," he said eventually, "I should get back to Megan. Of course." He took a step, then paused. "Elena," he began, then stopped himself. Whatever he'd been about to say remained unspoken. With a slight nod, he walked away. I watched him go, struck by how little I felt. Not bitterness or anger or even satisfaction at having won our legal battle. Just a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, moving forward into a future I was creating for myself. Later that evening, as I drove home to my new apartment, a light-filled space overlooking the park that I'd decorated entirely to my own taste, I realized something profound had shifted within me. The divorce that Richard had intended as my diminishment had instead become my liberation. He had announced over Tuesday night dinner that I would get nothing. He had dismissed my contributions, devalued my support, discounted my intelligence. He had expected me to accept his assessment and fade quietly into the background of his life. Instead, I had discovered something he had overlooked for 12 years, not just page 7 with its sunset clause, but the woman who had always been more than just his wife. The woman who had always deserved more than just what he decided to give her. In the end, I hadn't gotten nothing from our divorce. I had gotten everything that mattered: my self-respect, my independence, my future, and yes, my fair share of our material wealth. I had gotten the chance to discover who I was beyond the reflection in Richard's eyes. It turned out that was worth more than anything that could be written into a prenuptial agreement, even on page 7. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.